In the year 1012, there were two great kingdoms at the edge of the known world, separated by 300 miles of open desert, and a hatred so old that even the elders had forgotten what first lit its flame. To the west sat the kingdom of Wagara. Its people were miners, traders, and keepers of the deep earth. Beneath the red hills of Wagara lay veins of gold so pure that merchants from across the sea came with camels heavy with goods just to carry a handful of it home. The king of Wagara was a man named Soumba, the broad-shouldered, and he had ruled for 22 years with a patience that his enemies mistook for weakness. His palace was built from mud, brick, and cedar. Its walls hung with lion skins and copper mirrors that caught the morning sun and threw it back in orange fire. The people of Wagara wore gold in their hair, on their wrists, and woven into the collars of their robes. Children were given small gold pendants when they were born, little sons on leather cords, and when they died, those pendants were buried with them. Gold was not just wealth in Wagara. It was identity. It was memory. It was the word of God made heavy and warm in the palm of your hand. To the east, beyond the desert, lay the kingdom of Tassara. And if Wagara was a kingdom of earth, Tassara was a kingdom of water, or rather, of what happens to water when it leaves. The great salt flats of Tassara stretched for miles in every direction, blinding white under the sun, the ancient beds of lakes that had dried 10,000 years ago and left behind the mineral wealth of a vanished world. Tassaran workers cut salt in thick rectangular blocks, loaded them onto caravans, and sent them south and north and east across the continent. Every man who cooked meat needed Tassaran salt. Every woman who preserved fish needed it. Every army that marched needed it. Salt kept the living alive and the dead from rotting. The queen of Tassara was a woman named Aya of the long memory. She had earned that name not from any gift of prophecy, but from the stories she carried, thousands of them, passed from her grandmother's grandmother to her grandmother, to her mother, to her. She could recite the name of every king and queen of Tassara, going back 12 generations, and the story of every war they had fought, and how each war had ended. She kept this knowledge the way her kingdom kept salt, carefully, in controlled conditions, knowing its value might not be apparent until the moment of greatest need. Between Wagara and Tassara, the silken salt road ran like a thin brown thread. It had existed for longer than either kingdom, older than the names they gave themselves. A track beaten into the earth by the feet of merchants and pilgrims and wanderers who had understood, long before any king did, that gold is useless if it cannot buy preservation, and salt is useless if it cannot buy beauty. The two kingdoms had always hated each other, but they had always traded. That was the world in the year 1012. Then the rains stopped. The drought did not announce itself. That is the cruelest thing about droughts. They do not send messengers. They do not declare war. They simply do not come year after year. And by the time you understand what is happening, it is already much too late. The first year without rain, the farmers of both kingdoms looked at the sky and shrugged. Dry years happened. The wells were deep. The granaries were full. In the markets of Wagara's capital city, merchants still laughed and argued over prices, and children still chased goats down the narrow streets, and the smell of roasting meat rose every evening into air that was only slightly drier than it should have been. In Tassara, Queen Aya noticed sooner than anyone else. She had her grandmother's stories. She knew that 300 years ago, a dry year had come, and then another, and then the wells at the eastern edge of the kingdom had gone silent one by one, like lamps running out of oil. She ordered extra water stored in the deep cisterns beneath the palace. Her advisors thought she was being dramatic. She did not argue with them. She just kept filling the cisterns. By the end of the first dry year, the price of salt on the silken salt road had not yet risen. There was still plenty. The salt flats of Tassara did not need rain to produce salt. They had been dry for 10,000 years already. What they needed was the labor of workers, and workers needed food, and food needed rain. But in the first year, the stores held. No one starved. No one panicked. The year ended. The rains did not come. In the second year without rain, the granaries began to empty in both kingdoms. In Wagara, King Soumba ordered his merchants to buy grain from the southern kingdoms, paying in gold. This they did, and for a season the people ate, though the grain tasted of long travel and strange soil. But the southern kingdoms were beginning to feel the drought too. The great river that fed them had dropped 2 feet in a single season. By midsummer of the second year, the southern merchants were reluctant to sell what they had. Soumba paid more gold. The grain came, but in smaller quantities, and at prices that made his treasury officials go pale. In Tassara, the wells at the eastern edge of the kingdom went silent. They did not go silent slowly. One morning they were working, and 3 days later they were not. And between those 2 moments, nothing had happened except the quiet subtraction of water from stone. The workers at the eastern salt flats needed water to live. When the water was gone, they moved west, crowding into the central cities, and the eastern flats went unworked, and a quarter of Tassara's salt production simply stopped. This is when the price of salt began to move. It moved slowly at first, the way a stone begins to roll on a hillside, so gradually that you might think it had always been rolling. A block of salt that had cost 3 gold pieces on the silken salt road in the spring cost 4 by midsummer and 5 by autumn. The merchants who bought and sold along the road began to notice something strange. The traders coming from Wagara seemed nervous. They were buying more salt than usual, buying it quickly, not haggling the way they normally did. Word spread along the road, as word always does. Salt prices rose again. By the end of the second year, a block of Tassaran salt cost more than a finger ring of Wagaran gold. This had never happened in living memory. Perhaps it had never happened at all. In Tassara, Queen Aya sat alone in the room where she kept her grandmother's stories and thought for a long time about what she knew of history. She thought about armies and about hunger, and about the way that desperate men convince themselves that taking is easier than trading. She began to move soldiers to the border. In the third year without rain, the diplomats arrived. Wagara sent 3 men to the court of Tassara, carrying gifts of gold and a carefully worded letter from King Soumba. The letter proposed a treaty, a fixed price for salt, guaranteed for 10 years to be paid in gold at a rate that both parties would agree upon now, before the crisis deepened. It was a reasonable letter. It was the kind of letter that could have ended the story here, with no blood spilled, with both kingdoms weakened but alive. Queen Aya read the letter twice. She thought about her grandmother's stories. She thought about what it meant to fix a price during a famine. It meant that Wagara would pay the same amount no matter how desperate it became, and that Tassara would receive the same amount no matter how scarce its salt became. It was a good deal for Wagara. It was not a good deal for Tassara. She wrote back politely. She said she would need more time to consider. Soumba, reading her reply in his gold-hung palace, felt the first cold finger of something he had not felt in 22 years of rule. He did not name the feeling. He sent a second letter with more gold and a warmer tone, and a suggested price that was somewhat higher than the first. He was being generous, he told himself. He was being wise. Aya sent back another polite reply. She still needed time. In the markets of Wagara, the price of preserved meat was now twice what it had been 2 years before. Men who had spent their whole lives surrounded by gold were beginning to realize, with a vertigo that must have felt like the world tipping sideways, that gold could not fill a stomach. You cannot eat gold. You cannot preserve food without salt. You can be the richest man in the world and still starve with your hands full of yellow metal. Soumba sent a third letter. The tone was less warm. Aya did not reply. In the corridors of the Tassaran court, her generals were telling her what she already knew, that Wagara was desperate, that desperate kingdoms made dangerous neighbors, and that the time to negotiate from strength was before the other side decided that negotiation was no longer its best option. Strike first, they said. March on the gold mines. Take the source of Wagara's wealth and use it to buy grain from the southern kingdoms and outlast the drought. Aya listened. She did not agree with them, but she listened, because disagreeing with people who are right about part of a problem is more dangerous than agreeing with people who are wrong about everything. The part they were right about was this: Wagara was going to move. The only question was when and in which direction. The answer came in the form of 300 Wagaran soldiers crossing the desert in the night. They were not supposed to be soldiers, officially. They were, according to the documents they carried, a merchant escort, heavily armed, but a merchant escort nonetheless. They were headed for a Tassaran salt depot 3 days' march inside the border, a way station on the Silk and Salt Road where caravans rested and traded, and where, at that moment, there were approximately 4,000 blocks of salt waiting to be shipped north. They did not buy the salt. They loaded it onto camels and turned back for Wagara. The 20 Tassaran workers at the depot who tried to stop them were not killed. Soumba had been very specific about that in his orders. No blood, just salt. They were beaten badly enough to be unable to give chase, and left in the sun to find their own way home. They found their way home. They told Queen Aya what had happened. She sat very still for a long time after they finished. Then she said, "Send the soldiers." She did not say it the way a woman who wants war says it. She said it the way a woman who has read enough history says it, with a kind of exhausted certainty, the recognition that something was now in motion that could not be stopped, only survived. Her generals left to give their orders. Aya stayed alone in the room of her grandmother's stories for the rest of the night, and what she thought about, no one ever knew, because she did not write it down, and she did not speak of it afterward. Both armies were large. That was the first problem. Wagara had been a wealthy kingdom for generations, and wealthy kingdoms buy soldiers, trained soldiers, armed soldiers. Soumba's army numbered 30,000, light cavalry on desert horses, infantry in leather and iron, and the feared Wagaran archers, who could put an arrow through a palm leaf at 200 yards. They knew the desert as men know their own houses. They had crossed it in raids before, a dozen times over the years, quick strikes and retreats. This was to be a larger version of those raids, a show of force to make Tassara understand that Wagara would not starve quietly. Tassara's army was smaller, perhaps 22,000, but they were fighting on their own territory, which is worth another 10,000 soldiers in any calculation. And Aya had done something clever, which her generals had initially argued against. She had pulled her forces back from the border and let Wagara cross the desert. The desert would fight for her, at least a little. Crossing 300 miles of open sand in a drought year, with the sun at its height and the wells uncertain, cost the Wagaran army. Not catastrophically. Soumba was not a fool, and he had planned the crossing carefully, with water carried in sealed clay pots on 200 extra camels. But it cost them horses. It cost them men who collapsed in the heat and were left at small camps to recover. It cost them food that spoiled and water that leaked from pots that cracked in the heat. By the time the Wagaran army crossed into Tassaran territory, it was 30,000 minus 2,000, and every man in it was thinner than he had been. They were also angry. Hunger and sun and sand have a way of burning away the more complicated emotions, the guilt, the ambivalence, the lingering sense that perhaps this was not entirely right, and leaving behind something simpler and hotter. The Wagaran soldiers had been told that Tassara was hoarding salt, that the rising prices were not the result of a drought, but of Tassaran greed, that the salt that should have been flowing freely along the road had been deliberately withheld to drive Wagara to its knees. They believed this because they needed to believe something, because believing nothing is unbearable when you are marching through the desert. Aya's scouts watched them come and sent word back every hour. The first great battle was fought on the salt flats themselves. Aya had chosen the ground carefully. The white flats were blinding in the midday sun, a flat, featureless expanse where the only shelter was the shimmer of heat rising from the ground. She positioned her infantry in a long line across the flattest part of the plain, and put her cavalry on the wings, hidden behind low ridges of dried earth that were barely visible against the white sky. The Wagaran army came in the early morning, while it was still cool enough to fight. Soumba had good generals, and they recognized a defensive formation when they saw one. They spread their own line wide, matching Tassara's deployment, and sent their archers forward to harass the front line before the main bodies met. The archers were extraordinary. Anyone who had ever fought Wagara said the same thing, that Wagaran arrows came in waves, like water, and that the sound of them was like nothing else on earth. A sound between a whisper and a shriek, thousands of shafts cutting the air simultaneously. The Tassaran front line buckled under the first volley and straightened, buckled and straightened, men going down and the men behind them stepping forward, and the white salt flats turning red in long, thin lines. Then the infantry met. Battles of this size, when two bodies of 30,000 and 22,000 people crash into each other, do not feel like what the histories describe. They do not feel like tactics and maneuvers. They feel like the end of the world, noise beyond noise, the smell of blood and fear, and the specific smell of men who have been marching for days. The complete impossibility of seeing more than the 5 or 6 men immediately around you. Soldiers fight, in these moments, not for their kings or their kingdoms, but for the men beside them. The reasons for the battle, the salt, the gold, the drought, the letters unanswered and the border crossed, all of that becomes abstract and meaningless. What remains is only this: survive. Protect the man on your left. The battle lasted the better part of a day. Wagara's cavalry tried to sweep around the Tassaran right wing and was met by Aya's hidden horsemen in a collision so violent that the sound of it, witnesses said, could be heard 2 miles away. Both cavalry forces effectively destroyed each other, 6,000 horses and riders becoming, in the space of an hour, a tangle of fallen men and screaming animals that neither side could use again. At the end of the day, Wagara still held the field, which is to say, they had not retreated, but they had not broken the Tassaran line, and they were miles from water, in a desert, and they had been fighting for 12 hours. Soumba ordered his generals to find water. There was none to find. An army that cannot find water in a desert is not an army for very long. Soumba was a good king and a capable commander, and he understood what was happening. He ordered a retreat toward the border, disciplined, controlled, nothing like a rout. His men obeyed, because they were professional soldiers, and because they trusted him. And for the first day, the retreat proceeded in good order. On the second day, men began to fall out of line. Not deserting, not at first, simply falling. Sitting down in the sand and not getting up. Their bodies had been working too hard for too long with too little water, and the machinery of flesh and blood and bone had finally found its limit. Other soldiers stopped to help them, then found they could not help them, then kept moving, because stopping meant dying alongside them. By the third day, the retreat had become something else. The discipline had not broken entirely. Soumba himself rode up and down the column, shouting orders, physically pulling men back into line. But it had frayed in ways that could not be repaired. Men who had fought together for years were leaving each other to die. Men who had shared food and water without question were now hiding what little they had. The social contract that makes an army was dissolving in the heat, one small betrayal at a time. Aya's cavalry followed at a careful distance. She had given specific orders. Do not charge the retreating army. Follow, appear, let the desert do the work. She was right that this would be effective. She was perhaps not right to feel no grief about it. But she was a queen in a drought, and her people were dying too, quietly, in ways that no one wrote about. Children in the outer villages, old people in the eastern settlements where the wells had gone dry, farmers who had eaten their seed grain and had nothing left to plant when the rains finally came, if they ever came. When the Wagaran army reached the border, it had lost a third of its strength, not to Tassaran spears, but to sand and sun, and the absence of water. Soumba crossed back into Wagara and sat in his tent for a long time. Then he began planning the next campaign. What followed was not one war, but a series of wounds. Wagara raided. Tassara counter-raided. Tassara struck at the gold mines on Wagara's northern border, not to hold them, but to destroy the equipment, the wooden frames, and rope and bucket systems that allowed miners to work the deep veins. Wagara responded by poisoning 3 wells on the Tassaran side of the border, filling them with dead animals and bitter desert herbs. Tassara burned a caravan road, not the road itself. You cannot burn sand, but the way stations along it, the small buildings where caravans rested and stored water, without which the road was impassable. Both sides were hurting each other. That was the point. Neither side was able to win. That was the catastrophe. Because while they were hurting each other, the drought continued. A drought does not care about politics. It does not distinguish between enemies or make exceptions for people who have more important problems to deal with. It simply continues to not rain year after year, and the ground continues to dry, and the wells continue to drop, and the grain continues to fail, and the people continue to go hungry. In Wagara, the price of salt was now 10 times what it had been before the drought. Salt was no longer a condiment. It was a military resource, rationed by the army, distributed in tiny quantities to the civilian population on the basis of need. People went without. Food that would have been preserved rotted. The great salt trade that had been the foundation of Wagaran prosperity for generations had been severed, and in its place was a black market so large that the king's tax collectors could no longer pretend to suppress it. In Tassara, the situation was different, but no less desperate. The salt flats still produced. There was no shortage of salt. What there was a shortage of was food, because the agricultural regions of Tassara had been ravaged, first by the drought, then by Wagaran raids, then by the army's constant movement back and forth across the farmland that people were trying to tend. Soldiers and farmers cannot both use the same ground at the same time. The soldiers were always there. The farmers kept trying and kept failing. People were leaving. That was the thing that no one wanted to say aloud, that the citizens of both kingdoms, the people whose ancestors had built these places and given them their names and died to defend them, were quietly picking up what they could carry and walking away. South, mostly, to the greener kingdoms below the desert, where at least the wells had not all failed. They left in ones and twos at first, then in families, then in whole villages that simply emptied overnight, the houses standing open and dark. Soumba saw it happening. Aya saw it happening. Both of them, separately, in their separate palaces, understood what it meant. An empty kingdom is not a kingdom. It is a territory waiting for someone else to name it. In the 7th year of the drought, Soumba decided to end it. Not the drought. No human being had ever ended a drought. He decided to end the war, and by ending the war, to end the slow bleeding of his kingdom before there was nothing left to bleed. He assembled his army, what remained of it, half the strength of the force he had sent across the desert 5 years before. And he marched. Not for a raid, not for a demonstration of force. He marched for Tassara's capital city, the white-walled city of Essa, which sat at the center of the salt flats like a bone tooth rising from a pale jaw. He was going to take Essa, and once he had Essa, he would control the salt, and with the salt he would buy grain, and with grain he would feed his people, and that was the end of the story he had written in his head. What he had not written in his head was what Aya did. She abandoned Essa. Not suddenly, not in panic. She had been thinking about this for 2 years. She had been quietly moving the things that mattered. The deep grain stores, the water cisterns, the children of the noble families, the sacred objects, the administrative records, to a second city, a smaller one, built into the rocky hills at the far eastern edge of the kingdom. She had told no one the full plan, because plans that are fully explained are plans that can be responded to. When Soumba's army arrived at Essa, they found its gates open and its streets empty. They found houses with fires still burning, with pots still on them, meals abandoned mid-preparation. They found temples with their sacred objects gone and their walls stripped of their copper decorations. They found the great salt warehouses open, with the salt blocks stacked neatly inside. They also found that the wells had been sealed. Not destroyed, but sealed. Filled from the bottom with a mixture of sand and rubble that would take weeks to clear. Work that required tools that the Wagaran army had not brought with it. Soumba took Essa. He took the salt. He had almost no water. He sent riders back across the desert for water. Some of them made it. The water they returned with was not enough. The army began to ration. Then Tassara's cavalry came out of the eastern hills. The battle outside Essa lasted 2 days. Aya's army was not large. She had spent 7 years in a drought, same as anyone. But her soldiers were fighting near their water, near their supply lines, near the rocky hills where they could retreat and rest and drink. Soumba's army was fighting in the middle of a salt flat, in a city they did not know, with a supply line that stretched 300 miles across open desert. There is a kind of fighting that happens when men know they have no good options. when retreat means the same death as advance, only slower, when the calculation of survival no longer favors caution. Soumba's soldiers fought like that, not bravely exactly, but with a ferocity that comes from having nothing left to protect except the idea of being alive one more day. They held the walls of Essa for 2 days against a force that should have overwhelmed them. On the 3rd day, the water ran out. Soumba's generals came to him with a choice: surrender or attempt a breakout through the Tassaran lines and run for the desert. He looked at his generals, and he saw in their faces that they were dying, not figuratively but literally, in the specific way that dehydrated men begin to die, the eyes going flat, the skin losing its resilience, the voice going rough and thin. He chose the breakout. It was not successful in the way that he had hoped it would be, but it was not the massacre that it might have been, because Aya stopped her generals from pursuing the retreating Wagarans into the desert. "Let the desert finish it," she said again, the same words she had used 5 years before. She was right again. The desert finished it. Soumba reached Wagara. Fewer than 1,000 men reached it with him. He walked into his capital city, his gold palace, his room of copper mirrors, and found it nearly empty. The people had gone south in the years he had been fighting. The merchants were gone. The craftspeople. The farmers who had nothing left to farm. The children with their gold pendants. He sat in his throne room for 3 days, they say, seeing no one, eating nothing. On the 4th day, he sent a messenger to Tassara asking for terms of peace. The messenger crossed the desert and arrived in Aya's new city, the rocky one in the hills, and was received politely. Aya read the letter from Soumba and thought for a long time. Then she sent back a reply that no one expected. She sent back an offer of union. Not conquest, not surrender. Union. 2 kingdoms, 1 government, 1 economy, both histories respected. She proposed that Wagara's gold and Tassara's salt be managed together, as a single resource, distributed not by price but by need, in the proportions that would allow the maximum number of people to survive the drought. She proposed that the Silk and Salt Road be declared a common resource of the United Kingdom, maintained by both peoples. She included, at the end of the letter, a sentence that those who read it later found either very wise or very cold. The sentence was this: "Our children's children will not remember which of us was Wagara and which was Tassara. They will only remember whether anyone was left." Soumba accepted. The union was called, simply, Sahel, a word from the old trade language of the road, meaning shore or edge or boundary, the shore of the desert, the edge of what was possible. It lasted 11 years before it collapsed, as many unions born from desperation collapse into competing factions and old grievances given new names. But 11 years is enough time for a generation of children to grow up knowing only one kingdom, and some of them, at least, carried that knowledge into the kingdoms that came after. The drought broke in the 9th year of Sahel. It broke the way it had come, without announcement, without drama. 1 year it rained more than it had, and then a little more, and the wells began to fill, and the salt flats of Tassara were found to be unaffected, still producing, still white and enormous under the sun. The gold mines of Wagara were reopened, slowly, by the workers who had stayed or returned. The populations of both kingdoms never fully recovered, in the old sense. Too many people had left. Too many had died. Not in battle mostly, but in the quiet, persistent ways that droughts kill people, the ways that do not make good stories. But people came back, too, some of them, following the rains south. New families built on the ruins of old ones, the road was rebuilt, and the caravans moved again, and the price of salt on the silken salt road went back down to something that a person could afford. Of Soumba and Aya, history says almost nothing after the union. They met once, in person, at a ceremony in the city of Essa, which had been repopulated and given new walls. Those who were present said they greeted each other with courtesy, and said very little of consequence, in the way of two people who have been trying to kill each other for years, and are now required to sit at the same table. What they thought of each other, whether they respected each other, whether they hated each other, whether they recognized in each other the mirror of their own desperation and ambition and grief, none of that was written down. Only the kingdoms were written down, and the drought, and the salt, and the road between them, which was there before either of them was born, and which was there after both of them were gone.